In February 1763, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Paris, ending at last the 7 Years' War. King George III now rules more territory across the globe than was ever held by the Roman Empire. But the territory in North America is now so vast, the British must find a new way to manage it. The king issues the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Among its provisions is a new boundary. The proclamation goes even further than the Treaty of Easton, asserting that all lands west of the Appalachians, the heart of the continent, are reserved for the Indians. And yet, more immigrants than ever are settling in the backcountry. In the 1760s, the Ohio country plays host to a new migration from Britain and other parts of Europe. Newcomers cut their way into North America's interior, often marking the corners of their land claims with their initials. The migration was fueled by letters from friends and relatives who had served with British forces during the French and Indian War. Colonials had been fighting for access to the continent's vast interior. After all, that's what they thought the war was all about. And now the king has declared the very land they are settling is off limits, reserved for Indians. And there was another source of tension: money. The war had doubled Britain's national debt. British taxpayers had long shouldered the burden. Now Parliament expected American colonists to pay their share. A small tax on paper, the Stamp Act, causes an unexpectedly violent reaction in the colonies. Riots break out. Tax officials are burned in effigy and forced from their jobs. The tax is widely ignored. Why is the reaction so incendiary? The root of colonial frustrations can be traced to the French and Indian War. As far back as 1755, General Braddock had met resistance when he demanded the colonists pay toward the cost of the war.
You cannot tell me you have not the power to make these little assemblies do the king's will.
The relationship changed when William Pitt became the king's prime minister and treated the colonists with respect.
Letters, gentlemen, from London.
They had been happy to contribute to the war effort as long as they were considered full partners in the empire with the same rights as people in Britain. But now, Parliament imposes this new tax without their consent. The colonists feel betrayed. British policy increasingly frustrates George Washington. It is an obstacle on his path towards prosperity as a planter and land speculator. In the fall of 1770, Washington visits his land surveyor, who has lined up some choice parcels in the Ohio country. His journey takes him back to the places where he had once fought for the British Empire. Near the forks of the Ohio, where he had barely survived the first real battle of the war at Fort Necessity. As a reward for their service in the French and Indian War, colonial soldiers were promised land. Washington is here today to reap his reward. But because the Royal Proclamation of 1763 preserves the West for the Indians, he knows he can't take possession. Yet. Like many people, he believes it won't be long before he can. On his trip, Washington dines at Fort Pitt.
I saw some exceeding fine land. There is an opening prospect in the backcountry for adventurers, where an enterprising man with very little money may lay the foundation of a noble estate in new settlements for himself and posterity.
And what of the proclamation line? Are we not to protect the Indian lands? Surely we must give the Indians something if we are to keep the peace.
I can never look upon that proclamation in any other light but as a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. It must fall, surely, in a few years.
The Crown itself has not yet consented.
Consent or no, they're settling it as fast as a wildfire. Last year, I'm sure there were between 4,000 and 5,000. And all this spring and summer, the roads are lined with wagons, all moving to the Ohio.
Any person who neglects the opportunity of hunting out good lands and, in some measure, marking and distinguishing them as their own will never regain the opportunity.
It was 20 years before that Washington had first been dispatched to secure this territory for the British Empire. His guide on that journey was the Seneca chief Gayasuta. It's ironic that they would meet again now as Washington seeks to acquire the land for himself. Like so many Indians, Gayasuta was used to a world where two empires could be played off each other. Nevertheless, the Seneca chief seems pleased to see Washington again.
In the person of Gayasuta, I found an old acquaintance, he being one of the Indians that went with me to the French in 1753. He expressed satisfaction in seeing me and greeted us with great kindness. He thanked me for saying that peace and friendship was the wish of my people, and again expressed his people's desire and their friendly disposition to the white people.
Despite their friendliness, Gayasuta knows that Washington is not here merely to pay a social call, but to acquire land. It is only British policy that's holding Washington back, just as British policies are angering colonists elsewhere. In New England, a clash of expectations leads to mounting tension. British rule is seen as heavy-handed. A riot ends when redcoats kill 5 in what colonists call the Boston Massacre. They see Britain as riding roughshod over the rights of colonial assemblies. Radicals increasingly assert the right of self-rule. In December 1773, things come to a head over yet another tax, this time on tea. Britain's reaction to the Boston Tea Party is severe. The Crown floods Boston with troops and rewrites the colony's charter. Even moderates like Washington find these developments disturbing. When he and his colleagues express solidarity with Boston, the royal governor dissolves Virginia's legislature. They reconvene at the nearby Raleigh Tavern.
For my part, I shall not undertake to say where the line between Great Britain and the colonies should be drawn, but I am clearly of the opinion that one ought to be drawn, and our rights clearly ascertained. I could wish, I own, that this dispute had been left to posterity to determine, but the crisis is upon us, and our rights must be asserted.
And yet, even at this moment of crisis, colonists like Washington have no interest in breaking away from the empire. Their concerns amount to a family argument, not a call to revolution. This portrait shows Washington wearing a gorget, the mark of a British officer. It affirms his allegiance to the crown. In September 1774, at the First Continental Congress, Washington and other colonial representatives call for a coordinated effort to resist British actions. Relations with Britain continue to deteriorate, and Washington is drawn further into the fray. A stream of admirers come to Mount Vernon to seek his political and military counsel. Americans prepare to defend what they see as their rights, by force of arms if necessary. In April 1775, fighting erupts in Massachusetts between colonial and British forces. This is no longer a family feud, a dispute between loyal members of the empire. Once blood has been shed, there's no going back. With Boston under siege, a second Continental Congress is convened. Washington no longer aspires to be a British gentleman. He used to order his suits cut to the latest styles in London. To this Congress, he wears the uniform he designed for Virginia's new militia. It has been 20 years since the young, naive colonel set off into the backcountry to join a battle sparking an epic struggle. Now he anticipates a new battle. The Second Continental Congress must organize a war and decide who will lead it.
Washington! Welcome!
Some take Washington's uniform as a statement that he is prepared to lead the colonial forces. John Adams notes, his great experience and abilities in military matters is of much service to us. Then Adams nominates him to be commander of the Continental Forces.
Resolved that a general be appointed. George Washington, Esquire, is unanimously elected, and that he will command...
It was utterly out of my power to refuse this appointment without exposing my character to such censure as would have reflected dishonor upon myself. I shall rely, therefore, confidently upon that providence which heretofore has preserved and been bountiful to me.
A year later, Washington is preparing ragtag Continental troops for battle. It is 21 years to the day since Washington witnessed General Braddock's stunning defeat in the first major battle of the French and Indian War.
I did not let the anniversary of the 9th of this month pass without a grateful remembrance of the escape we had on the banks of the Monongahela.
It is the same providence that spared him that horrendous day, Washington hopes, which will see them through the battle to come. Like Washington, many of these soldiers are veterans of another war, a war fought fervently on behalf of their empire, not against it. How unexpected, how ironic. Britain won the war for America, but in doing so, it unleashed passions that will lead it to lose America.
Gentlemen, a declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object
inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction.
And that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved.
That same month, at the forks of the Ohio, the heart of events for the past 23 years, colonial representatives meet with Gayasuta. He tries to assert Indian dominion over the land.
We will not suffer either the English or Americans to march an army through our country. I am appointed by the Six Nations to take care of this country. And I will.
And he tries. To maintain the independence of his people, Gayasuta needs a powerful ally. But the French are gone forever, and the British would abandon the Indians to their fate. Under President Washington, Americans forced the Indians off the lands that Gayasuta vowed to defend. In 1754, no one in America imagined that a backwoods territorial dispute would end up transforming the world. But the French and Indian War did just that. By eliminating France's empire in North America, by allowing British leaders to believe they could exercise power without restraint, by convincing colonists they had no choice but to resist that power, even to the point of revolution, and by depriving Indian people of the allies needed to help protect their land and their autonomy. No one expected any of this to happen, but by changing the face of the continent, the French and Indian War became the war that made America.